the arrogance bolder, as if those feeding on his empire believed themselves untouchable. He moved quietly through the shining corridors, his head lowered like a tired worker, but his eyes were sharp, catching every smirk, every careless word, every sign that his patience was nearing its end. Near the conference hall, he stopped to scrub a corner of the floor while a group of executives gathered inside, the door left open just enough for him to hear, their voices carried with laughter. As they discussed their next move, one boasted about selling more weapons under hidden contracts, another sneered that the CEO was too blind, too comfortable in his tower to ever notice. They spoke as though he were already gone, as though the company was theirs to carve into pieces. The disguised man's jaw clenched, but he kept his head low, his silence burning, their words feeding. The fire that was no longer shock but fury contained in stillness. They mocked his name, his legacy, his people, and he promised himself they would pay, not with anger, but with truth so undeniable it would bury them. Later, in the cafeteria, he saw the divide sharper than ever. The human workers sat weary, their shoulders bent under long hours, while alien supervisors lounged in comfort, laughing at them openly. One alien mocked the workers' accents again. Another declared that humans would always be servants, never leaders. The CEO's hand tightened on the mop handle until the wood creaked. He wanted to tear the disguise away, to remind them that the empire they mocked was carved by human hands, but he stayed silent, letting the words burn into his memory. For silence now was a weapon, a rope tightening around their arrogance, and, when it snapped, they would know. Near midnight, he drifted again toward the restricted floor, the place that had shown him the darkest truths. This time he did not only watch. He stepped closer, pushing his bucket into the shadows while he listened. Inside the room, voices argued in low tones. One insisted they needed to move faster, that shipments must reach rival fleets before anyone noticed. Another warned that rumors were spreading, that workers whispered about crates vanishing. But the first laughed, saying the CEO was nothing but a figurehead, too blind, too soft. His empire already theirs? The disguised man's breath slowed, his rage sharpening into resolve. They thought him blind, but he was standing at their door, watching, remembering, waiting. When he finally turned back to the empty halls, the building seemed colder, quieter, the laughter of traitors still echoing in his ears, but his silence was no longer the silence of patience. It was the silence before a storm, the silence that holds its breath before thunder shatters the sky. He walked slowly, the mop dragging behind him, but in his eyes burned a fire that promised the end was near. Soon the janitor's disguise would be shed. Soon the boardrooms would see the man they had mocked, not as a ghost in rags, but as the CEO they had underestimated, a death worlder whose silence was not weakness but judgment, and when it fell, the halls that had once carried whispers of betrayal would carry screams of reckoning. The eighth night was different from all the others, for the man who pulled on the janitor's uniform no longer wore it only as a disguise. He wore it as a symbol of everything he had learned. The CEO, who once ruled from the highest tower, now knew more truth than all his reports combined, and it weighed on him like armor, heavy but unbreakable. When he entered his building this time, the workers did not notice him. The supervisors did not glance at him. The executives still mocked in their rooms, but he walked with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen the very heart of betrayal, the mop in his hand steady, his steps slow, and his silence no longer. Curiosity but judgment waiting to be delivered, he moved through the glowing halls one last time, not to search, not to listen, but to confirm what he already knew. His empire had been turned into a marketplace for greed, its workers humiliated, its resources stolen, its name sold to enemies who laughed in the shadows. He swept the floor near the conference chamber where the highest managers gathered late into the night, their voices loud, careless, filled with confidence that the old man was blind. One said soon the CEO would be replaced, another said he was too weak to stop them even if he discovered the truth. Their laughter rolled through the air like knives, but the janitor in the corner did not react, his head bent, his silence sharper than any reply. He heard them speak of more shipments leaving at dawn, weapons marked with his company's seal, but destined for enemy fleets. He heard them divide profits, boast of bribes, and insult the very workers who kept the building alive. Every word carved deeper into the fire that had been growing inside him, a fire now ready to burn. Later, he walked past the cafeteria once more, the divide between the workers and their alien overseers clearer than ever, the humans bent over tired. Meals, their voices low and hopeless, while the aliens mocked them, claiming that humans were meant to serve, that their leaders were fools. The CEO paused, his mop leaning on the floor, his eyes locked on the scene. He realized then that the betrayal was not only financial or political, it was personal. It was an insult to his people, to the very heart of humanity, and it would not go unanswered. He turned away without a word, but his silence carried the promise of a reckoning none of them could imagine. At last he reached the restricted floor, the place where the darkest truth had revealed itself. The door slid open again, and inside he saw rows of crates stacked even. Higher, weapons gleaming in harsh light, and documents glowing on screens. Maps of human colonies, coordinates of fleets, information that no enemy should ever hold. His breath slowed, his fists tightened at his sides. He had all the proof he needed now. The evidence burned into his mind, and the time for silence had ended. He turned away and walked down the hall, the mop dragging softly behind him, the janitor's disguise complete for the last time. For when he returned, he would not be a shadow. He would be the storm. When the night cycle ended and dawn approached, the CEO left the building through the same doors he had entered, the guards barely glancing at him, dismissing him as just another worker, and for a moment he almost pitied them because they had no idea what they had allowed to pass, no idea who they had ignored night after night. He stepped into the rising light of the colony and pulled the cap from his head, his eyes narrowing, the fire inside him burning steady and cold. He had seen enough. He had heard enough. The empire he had built had been corrupted, but it was still his, and he would take it back, not with whispers, not with reports, but with truth that would crush every lie. His enemies had mistaken silence for weakness, but they had forgotten where he came from, forgotten that he was human, a death-worlder who did not forgive betrayal as he walked away, leaving the mop and bucket behind. He knew the next time he entered that building it would not be as a janitor, it would be as the CEO, and the shock of that revelation would tear through his company like thunder across the stars, leaving no traitor standing. In the cafeteria, two executives sat together, speaking in low but careless voices, one bragging that he had siphoned funds into off-world accounts, the other laughing that the old man would never know, that the CEO was blind, too far above. To see the cracks below, the disguised man's grip on the mop tightened until his knuckles ached. He wanted to reveal himself, to silence them with a single word. But he forced himself to remain still, listening as they mocked him, their arrogance a poison he would remember. He moved further into the lower levels, where the hum of machinery drowned most sounds, but in the corners where workers thought themselves alone, he found more pieces of the puzzle. Two alien supervisors were sorting through crates, removing items and slipping them into smaller containers marked with hidden codes, their laughter sharp as they joked that humans would never notice, that humans trusted too easily. His chest tightened at the sound. The very trust he had given was being used as a weapon against him. He leaned on his mop, his face blank, but his mind sharp, memorizing every detail, every mark, every word. For the time when silence would end, he passed a cluster of human workers on break, their voices low, filled with bitterness. One said, he wished the CEO cared enough to see what was happening. Another said the CEO only cared about profits, not people. Their words struck him harder than the betrayal of his managers because they showed how deeply his people felt abandoned. He wanted to tell them he was here, that he saw, that he cared, but he could not yet. Later in the night, he slipped into the service corridors again, those narrow halls where secrets often hid. And there he overheard two senior managers laughing about the council bribes, about how easy it was to buy silence from regulators. One of them whispered that soon the rival species would own a share of the company itself. And when that happened, the CEO would become nothing more than a figurehead, a puppet with no strings of his own. The disguised man's heart pounded, his jaw clenched, but still he remained quiet, forcing himself to remember every word, every name, every piece of evidence. He would not strike blind, not like them. He would strike with proof, with truth. And when he did, their laughter would die. When the building finally grew quiet, he found himself once more outside the restricted floor. The door sliding open just enough for him to glimpse inside, he crouched low, pretending to scrub the ground. And what he saw turned his silence into steel. Rows of weapons lined the walls more than before, gleaming rifles and heavy explosives stacked high, his company's seal stamped across each one, and workers moving quickly, preparing them for transport. His empire, built on sweat and vision, was being turned into an arsenal for enemies. The realization settled heavy in his chest. He had built his life's work to be a beacon of progress, but it had become a blade aimed at humanity itself, and the ones who held it were not rivals, but traitors from within. He turned away, his mop squeaking faintly against the tiles as he walked down the hall, his disguise still intact, his silence still unbroken, but his heart burned with fury. He had seen enough to know the truth, enough to know that betrayal reached to the highest levels of his company, and enough to know that when he revealed himself, it would not be with questions but with judgment. The janitor's uniform clung to him like shadow, but inside beat the heart of a death-worlder, calm until provoked, unstoppable when betrayed. And as he left the building that night, he carried not just a mop, but a vow. The next time he returned, it would not be as a janitor, but as the CEO, and those who had mocked his name would learn what it meant to underestimate a human. The sixth night felt heavier than the ones before, as if the walls of the building themselves carried the weight of the secrets he had uncovered. The CEO slipped, once again into his gray uniform, his mop and bucket in hand, his steps steady but his mind racing. He was no longer only searching for proof. He was watching for the faces of those who had betrayed him most. He wanted to see how deep the rot had spread, how many had sold their loyalty for credits and comfort. The empire he had built with vision and trust was being hollowed out like a shell, and each step in the janitor's disguise revealed more cracks in the foundation, cracks that no report had ever shown him, because reports could lie, but whispers in the dark could not. As he moved through the lobby that evening, he overheard two junior workers whispering about bonuses that never came, about supervisors pocketing money meant for them. One of them sighed that the CEO was probably too rich to care, that men like him lived in towers far above the struggles of the floor. The disguised man paused, his chest aching. Their words hurt more than the betrayal of his executives, because these workers had once believed in him, trusted the dream he sold, but now they thought of him as a ghost, a distant figure with no eyes for them. He lowered his head and kept moving, his silence burning like fire, promising himself they would know the truth one day, that he had seen them, heard them, remembered every word. Deeper into the building, he reached the archives again, those cold halls where secrets hid inside glowing panels. There he saw three men clustered together, one human and two aliens, their eyes scanning over stolen documents, their hands quick as they transferred files into small black drives. He froze in the shadows, his mop leaning against the wall. Their voices were low but clear, speaking of contracts with rival powers, of shipments already delivered, of payments that had already been received. One of them laughed that the CEO had no idea he was funding his own enemies. Another said the old man would never dare step down here, that he only saw the polished boardroom, not the dirt where real power moved. Their laughter was like knives, but the CEO's face did not move. His heart was steel now, his silence no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of judgment waiting for its hour. Later, in the executive dining area, he cleaned the floors while high-ranking managers drank wine and boasted loudly. One raised a glass and said the company was theirs now, that the CEO had no control anymore. Another smirked that soon they would replace him completely, install a puppet who would smile for the cameras while they sold everything in the shadows. The disguised man kept his head bowed, his mop gliding back and forth as if he were deaf. But inside his chest a storm raged. Every word another nail hammered into the coffin of their arrogance. They thought him blind, thought him gone. But he was here, listening, gathering. And soon they would learn that silence does not mean weakness. Silence means patience. Near midnight he walked once more toward the restricted floor. The place that had haunted him each night, the door opened and more crates were carried through. He caught the glimmer of weapons under the harsh lights, entire shipments being prepared for off-world transport, not for allies, but for enemies. Enemies who would use his own creations against humanity. His fists clenched so tightly the mop handle nearly cracked. His heart pounding, he wanted to step in, to shout, to break the illusion, but he knew it was not yet time. He turned away slowly, his silence deepening, each step heavier than the last, the bucket rattling faintly behind him like the echo of chains. By the time the building emptied and the halls grew quiet, the CEO walked alone, his mop dragging, his shoulders heavy, but in his eyes burned a cold fire. He had seen enough to understand the truth. His company was no longer just corrupted, it was compromised to its core. Betrayal had spread like a disease, and the ones he trusted most had become enemies in his own house. Yet he also knew that this disguise had given him the weapon he needed, the truth, undeniable and sharp. He would not wear the janitor's uniform much longer. He would not stay silent forever. Soon he would rise again, not as a shadow, but as the man they had forgotten, the Deathworlder CEO who had built this empire, and when he revealed himself, the halls that once echoed with laughter would echo with fear, and the galaxy would learn that no betrayal of a human goes unanswered. The seventh night of his disguise began like the others, but the man beneath the gray uniform was no longer the same. The CEO had entered these halls as a curious master, but now he walked them as a judge, carrying within him a silence sharper than any blade. The mop in his hands felt heavier, not because of its weight, but because of the truth it had helped him uncover. Betrayal had crawled into every corner of his empire, rotting trust, stealing resources, mocking the very name he had built across the stars. Yet tonight, he felt something different in the air. The whispers were louder. The third night of his disguise began with the same uniform, the same mop and bucket. But the CEO felt heavier as he stepped once more into the heart of his empire. The halls gleamed, polished and bright, but to him, they now looked like mirrors. Hiding shadows, every corner felt alive with secrets. Every laugh he overheard carried hidden knives. He moved slowly, carefully, blending into the flow of workers who ignored him as if he were nothing more than background noise. Yet behind his lowered eyes, his mind was sharp, searching, piecing together the fragments of betrayal he had already witnessed. And the more he walked, the clearer it became. His company was not just careless, it was poisoned. Near the shipping bay, he stopped to mop while heavy crates were being loaded onto small transport ships. Each box marked with codes he knew by memory, they were supposed to be routed to human colonies. Yet as he watched, one worker whispered to another about extra cargo headed to rival systems. The younger worker looked nervous, asking what would happen if the CEO found out. The older one laughed bitterly, saying the CEO never came down here. that he lived in the tower where numbers and reports were neat and clean. The disguised man tightened his grip on the mop handle. His teeth clenched, but he kept his silence, letting the truth stab deeper than any insult. It was not their laughter that cut him. It was the knowledge that they were right. He had trusted too easily, and that trust had been turned against him. Later, in the cafeteria, he saw the divide even clearer. The human workers sat hunched and tired, their food plain, while alien supervisors sat in clusters eating well and boasting loudly about bonuses and side deals. One alien even mimicked a human worker's accent, making the others roar with cruel laughter. The CEO's chest tightened with rage, his knuckles white on the mop. He wanted to reveal himself, to shatter their arrogance with a single word. But he forced himself to endure, because he needed the whole truth, not just pieces. He swept the floor at their feet, invisible, listening, their words spilling freely because, to them, he was no one, just a shadow with a bucket. When night deepened, and the crowds thinned, he walked toward the lower levels again, the places where whispers lived. He found himself near the archives, a cold hall lined with glowing panels, one door slightly open. Inside, two managers argued in hushed voices about missing funds, about transfers sent to accounts hidden in off-world banks. One of them said the auditors could be tricked for another cycle, the other worried about someone noticing, but they both agreed. The CEO would never look this far down. They laughed softly, confident in his blindness, and that laughter was worse than mockery. It was betrayal built on certainty. He felt his heart harden, his silence growing heavier. He had not spoken a word in days as a janitor, but every moment his anger sharpened into resolve. He was no longer only watching, he was hunting. In the final hours of that night, he returned to the restricted sector, the one place that kept calling him back. Again the door opened and workers slipped inside. This time he pushed his mop slowly, closer. Stopping just at the edge, he leaned as if tired, his head low but his eyes sharp. Through the gap, he saw screens glowing with maps of human colonies, contracts written in alien symbols, and crates filled with weapons, not tools, not trade goods, but weapons marked with his company's seal. His breath caught in his throat. His empire was not simply being stolen from, it was being used to arm enemies. To turn his life's work into a weapon against his own people, he stepped back quickly, his heart pounding, his disguise protecting him even as his soul burned with fury. He turned away, pushing the mop down the hall, his steps slow and heavy, for the truth was clear now. He had set out to see what his employees did when they thought he was not watching, and what he had discovered was darker than he imagined. His empire was rotting, his trust betrayed. His company turned into a blade aimed at humanity itself, and in the silence of the janitor's footsteps, he made another vow. He would not remain silent much longer. The fourth night began colder than the rest, not in temperature but in weight. For the CEO no longer entered his company as a curious man in disguise, but as a hunter carrying the burden of truth. The janitor's uniform clung to him like armor. His mop and bucket no longer tools of cleaning, but keys that opened doors. For no one questioned the presence of a janitor. No one stopped him when he walked the halls, and in that invisibility he was free to see the rot that others hid in plain sight. He moved past the lobby where executives greeted alien clients with wide smiles, their polished words dripping with false loyalty, and deeper into the heart of the building, where silence was heavier and shadows thicker, his ears sharp for every careless whisper, his eyes catching every hurried gesture. The empire he had built brick by brick now looked like a fortress built on sand. He made his way down to the underground logistics level, a place most executives never visited. The air smelled of oil and ozone, engines humming as cargo drones lifted and lowered crates marked with glowing seals. He leaned on his mop, watching, his eyes narrowing as he noticed entire shipments being rerouted, their destinations altered on digital panels with a flick of a worker's hand. These crates were supposed to feed human colonies, supply stations, where survival depended on steady deliveries, but the new codes flashed with alien markings, coordinates belonging to systems that were not allies. Systems that had once raised fleets against Earth. He pressed himself against the wall, pretending to wipe a smudge, his heart pounding as voices carried from the far side of the bay. Two supervisors, one human and one alien, argued in sharp tones. The human hissed that the risks were growing, that too many eyes might notice. But the alien laughed, saying the CEO was blind, locked away in his tower, too concerned with numbers to notice missing crates. They both laughed then, a cruel, hollow sound, and the CEO clenched his fists until his knuckles burned, forcing himself not to step forward, not to break the disguise, not yet. Hours later, he wandered toward the research wing, sweeping slowly, his ears pricked as he passed a half-open door. Inside, he saw technicians huddled around glowing screens, their faces lit with greed. They were cataloging alien tech, not for human progress but for secret trade. He heard them mutter about payments already made, contracts signed in shadows, his company's resources being sold without his knowledge. His breath caught, his silence growing heavier. He turned away before they could notice, but every step down the hall pressed harder against his chest. The empire he had believed in was slipping further from him with every discovery, every hidden deal, every whispered betrayal. Near the restricted floor again, the place that had haunted him each night, he slowed, pushing his bucket carefully. The door opened once more, and this time he dared to step closer, crouching low as if scrubbing the ground. Through the gap, he saw what he feared most, long rows of crates stacked high, weapons gleaming under harsh light, rifles, explosives, armor marked with his company's seal, each one ready for transport, each one destined not for allies but for enemies. He felt the weight of realization press down on him. His empire was not only bleeding, it had been turned against his own kind, and those he trusted most were the ones driving the blade. He pulled back into the shadows, his breaths shallow, his hands shaking with the effort to stay silent, for if he revealed himself now, he might never uncover the full depth of the betrayal. As he left the lower levels and returned to the higher halls, the building seemed different, colder, alien to him. The laughter of clerks in the distance no longer sounded like simple chatter, but like daggers. Every corner, every glowing screen now whispered lies, and he felt his silence turn into steel. He knew the truth now, knew that his disguise had shown him more than polished reports ever could, and he knew that soon this silence would break, not with a laugh, not with anger, but with the weight of truth so heavy that no traitor could escape it. He walked the halls like a shadow, his mop squeaking softly, but behind his lowered eyes burned a fire that promised judgment, and, when it came, it would shock not only his company, but the entire galaxy that had watched him as a symbol of wealth, never realizing the man behind the badge of CEO was a death-worlder who did not forgive betrayal. The fifth night of his disguise began with the same uniform, the same mop and bucket, yet the man wearing them was no longer simply curious. He was burning with quiet rage. The CEO, who had once sat in the highest towers, now walked the lowest corridors of his empire, invisible in plain sight, and every step deepened his resolve. The building that had once filled him with pride now felt like a fortress of lies, its polished glass hiding shadows, its bright halls echoing with whispers of betrayal. He pushed, his bucket slowly, pausing often, his head bowed like a weary worker, but his ears sharp, his eyes sharper, and it did not take long before he heard what he feared again. The CEO of the largest human corporation in the galaxy stood before a mirror in a small, empty room, his usual fine suit hanging neatly on a chair while he pulled on the plain gray uniform of a janitor. The cloth rough and ordinary against skin that was used to expensive fabric, he slipped on the cap, the gloves, the badge that meant nothing, and when he looked at his reflection, even he almost did not recognize himself. Gone was the man who commanded fleets of trade ships and controlled markets across 100 worlds. What stared back at him was a tired worker, invisible to the powerful, ignored by the busy, a shadow in the corner of a vast empire, and that was exactly what he wanted. For too long he had wondered what really happened in the halls of his company. When his eyes were not there, when his name was not spoken, he had heard whispers of corruption, of managers who bent rules, of alien supervisors who treated human workers as tools, but he never knew how deep it went, so tonight he would not be the CEO, he would be the janitor. He walked through the employee entrance instead of the golden lobby. No one stopped him, no one greeted him. A security guard glanced at him once and then dismissed him as if he were invisible. The CEO felt a strange chill. This was how his lowest workers lived, unseen, unheard, their sweat taken for granted. He carried a mop and a small bucket, pushing it slowly through the bright white corridors of his own headquarters, each wall lined with glowing screens that displayed profit margins and new projects, the kind of things he would normally smile at. But tonight they seemed like masks, shiny numbers hiding dirty truths. As he moved past a group of young staffers chatting near the break room, he heard them laugh about how no executive ever cared, how they could cut corners, sell scraps, and no one would ever notice. The CEO tightened his grip on the mop, but kept walking, his face blank, his disguise perfect. He had come to hear the truth, and now he was hearing it. The cafeteria was loud with voices. Workers of many species gathered around tables. Humans sat together, tired but smiling faintly as they ate their cheap meals while alien supervisors lounged at the center table. Plates piled high, their voices mocking. One alien with scaled skin joked that humans were slow, too fragile, good only for simple tasks. The CEO's chest tightened, anger boiling inside him, but he lowered his eyes and swept the floor near, their feet, his ears catching every cruel word. He thought of the reports he had read, the glowing numbers of growth, the clean summaries written by the very people laughing now. None of them had shown this truth. None had shown the daily humiliation. He swallowed his rage, forcing himself to remain quiet. For if he spoke, his disguise would shatter, and he needed to know more. Much more. Hours passed as he moved from floor to floor, invisible in his uniform. He watched managers signing off shipments without checking. He heard whispers of supplies going missing, of secret deals cut in shadows. One night shift employee muttered about files being deleted before audits. Another laughed that the CEO was blind, too far above to notice. Each word struck him like a knife, each laugh heavier than the mop he carried. He realized with growing dread that his empire was rotting from the inside, the very foundation of trust being sold by those he had raised to power. He wondered how long this had been happening, how much he had missed while sitting in his tower, listening to polished reports instead of real voices. Late in the night, when most of the building had grown quiet, he passed a restricted door that should have been locked, but it opened with a hiss, and two figures slipped inside, carrying small crates marked with codes he did not recognize. Curiosity pulled him closer. He leaned on his mop as if resting, but his eyes were sharp through the small crack he saw. Glowing devices, data drives, and files that had never reached his desk. His pulse quickened. His empire was not only being stolen from, it was being used for something hidden, something dangerous. He pulled away quickly before they saw him, his mind racing. His disguise had given him more than he expected, and the night was not even over. For the first time in years, the man who thought he knew everything about his company realized how blind he had been. And as he walked down the hall, mop dragging softly, his heart carried a single heavy truth. The real company was not in the reports, not in the boardroom, but in the shadows where the janitor walked unseen, and what he was beginning to see shocked him more than he was ready to admit. The morning cycle began with bright lights flooding the upper floors of the headquarters, but the CEO still dressed in his gray janitor uniform, was already there, pushing his mop quietly along the polished tiles, the smell of disinfectant in the air mixing with the faint scent of expensive perfume worn by executives rushing past. None of them looked at him. Not one paused to see the man who, in truth, signed their salaries. He was invisible by design, and it was in that invisibility that he began to see the cracks more clearly. He stopped near the glass walls of the strategy office where mid-level managers gathered around a glowing table, their voices sharp and hurried. One man bragged about moving shipments without clearance, another joked about charging phantom hours into the payroll system, and when a young worker hesitated, worrying they might get caught, the manager laughed and said the CEO only cared about numbers, not people. Those words stung sharper than any insult, because they showed how far trust had collapsed. The CEO gripped the mop harder, wanting to burst in and reveal himself, but he forced calm, reminding himself that he was here to listen, not to rule, not yet. In the cafeteria, he lingered again, sweeping around tables while humans ate quickly before rushing back to long shifts. He heard two young technicians whisper that they had seen alien supervisors rerouting resources, sending valuable materials off-world. They said nothing because they feared losing their jobs. Their voices were tired, hopeless, and the CEO's chest ached at their resignation. He had built this company to be a symbol of human strength, but what he was seeing was exploitation in every corner. He carried his bucket into the service corridors, narrow halls lined with pipes and humming vents, and there he overheard a conversation more dangerous than the rest. Two executives speaking in low tones about the off-record contracts, deals signed with species that were not allies but rivals, enemies who would pay for human secrets. One executive chuckled that the CEO never asked too many questions, that his trust was their best cover. The disguised man froze, his heart pounding. His empire was not only rotting, it was being sold piece by piece to those who would gladly see humanity fall. He lowered his head quickly and pretended to scrub the floor, but his mind raced with fury and fear. By midday, the building buzzed with activity, sleek ships docking. On the rooftop pads, new clients entering through glowing gates and employees rushing with data pads in their hands. But beneath the shine, he saw the truth more clearly now. He saw human workers dismissed when they asked for breaks. He saw alien overseers sneer at them while taking luxuries for themselves. He saw guards turning blind eyes to shipments leaving with no scans, and he realized the rot was everywhere, not a small corner, but woven into the fabric of the empire he had built, each lie, each theft, each cruelty happening under his own. Banners that spoke of progress and unity, yet hid betrayal and greed. He leaned on his mop, his jaw clenched, as he listened to another group of clerks mock him openly, calling the CEO nothing more than a name, a symbol who lived in a tower while the real company was theirs to twist. He said nothing, his silence heavier than any words he could speak. But deep inside, a fire began to burn, slow and steady. Not just anger, but determination. When the evening cycle began, the halls emptied slowly, the chatter fading into quiet, and once again he found himself near the restricted sector he had glimpsed the night before. The same two figures entered again, this time carrying larger crates. He followed at a distance, staying in the shadows, pretending to check floor panels when others passed. Through the narrow crack of the door, he saw glowing symbols on the crates, marks from rival worlds, marks that should never have been in his building. His empire was being used as a bridge for enemies to steal, to weaken humanity. His pulse quickened, and though he longed to step inside, to confront them, he knew it was not yet time. He needed proof, evidence that could not be denied. So he slipped away, his mop squeaking faintly against the floor as though covering his footsteps, but in his heart he made a silent vow. The janitor's disguise had shown him more truth in 2 nights than years of reports ever had, and now he would not stop until he uncovered every betrayal, until he saw the faces of every traitor laid bare. He had entered this disguise seeking honesty, But what he found was a nest of betrayal far greater than he imagined, and the deeper he looked, the darker it became.